I worked 3 weeks straight on that prototype. Not overtime, not company time, my own time, evenings, weekends, the 2 hours before sunrise when the house was quiet and my coffee was still hot and nobody needed anything from me. My name is not important yet. What's important is what I built. I called it Meridian. It was a predictive routing system, the kind that doesn't just optimize delivery paths, but learns from micro delays, weather patterns, driver behavior, even the time of day a specific road tends to back up. I've been thinking about it for 2 years before I wrote a single line of code. The idea came from watching my husband sit in traffic on I-95 every morning, watching him leave earlier and earlier and still arrive later. There had to be a smarter way to route, not just faster, but adaptive, self-correcting. I built Meridian in my home office on a secondhand laptop I bought off Facebook Marketplace for $180. My day job was logistics software QA at a mid-sized company I'll call Harlow Systems. My role was testing, documentation, flagging bugs. Nothing glamorous. I wore jeans most days. I ate lunch at my desk. I was good at my job in the invisible way that nobody notices until something breaks. Meridian had nothing to do with Harlow. Different tech stack, different architecture, built entirely on my personal machine, on my personal time, with no Harlow resources, no Harlow IP, no company anything. I know that now matters legally. I also know that doesn't always matter in practice. I made one mistake, just one. I mentioned it to my manager. Not in a formal meeting, not in writing. We were standing by the coffee machine on a Thursday afternoon, and he asked what I'd been up to, the way people ask when they're not really listening. And I said I'd been working on something kind of interesting, a routing optimization system, and his eyes changed just slightly. The way a person's eyes change when they stop thinking about themselves and start thinking about you. I thought nothing of it. I went home. I kept working. 3 weeks later, I was called into a meeting. The meeting had too many people in it. That's how you know a meeting is not actually a meeting. There was my manager, the VP of product, someone from legal I'd never seen before, and our CTO, a man who I'll call the director, because calling him by name would give him more than he deserves. The director did most of the talking. He said Harlow had become aware of a routing optimization tool I'd developed. He said the employment agreement I'd signed, and he slid a copy across the table like he'd been waiting to do that for days, contained a clause that assigned IP ownership to the company for any invention related to the company's field of operations developed during the period of employment. He said Meridian was related to logistics. Harlow was a logistics company. Therefore, under the agreement, Meridian belonged to Harlow. I sat very still. I'm not someone who raises her voice. I never have been. When I'm angry, I go quiet. And when I go quiet, I think. So I sat still and I thought, and what I thought was, this is not a discussion. This is a notification. I said I developed it entirely on personal time with a personal equipment. The VP of product nodded like that was a very reasonable thing to say. Legal cleared his throat. The director said the agreement didn't distinguish between company time and personal time. Only field of operations. I said I'd like to review the agreement with my own attorney before anything else. The director said, of course, Absolutely. Take all the time I needed. He was very smooth about it. That's the thing about people who've done something before. They're smooth. I drove home. I called my sister from the driveway. I sat there for 40 minutes. She said, "Do you have a copy of everything?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said, "Don't do anything yet." I didn't do anything yet. I found an employment attorney. Her name was Margaret, and she had the energy of someone who had heard every version of this story and was quietly furious on behalf of all of them. She reviewed my employment agreement, my development logs, my GitHub commit timestamps, my receipts for the laptop, and the cloud storage I'd paid for out of pocket. Margaret said the clause was broad but potentially unenforceable depending on state law. I was in Connecticut. Connecticut had specific protections for employees who develop inventions on their own time without company resources. The clause Harlow was relying on was aggressive, probably written to intimidate more than to survive litigation. Probably, she said. Not definitely. I asked her what she recommended. She said, document everything, don't transfer anything, and don't let them touch the code base. I said I had no intention of letting them touch anything. What I didn't tell Margaret, what I hadn't told anyone, was that Meridian already had a self-destruct mechanism built into it. Not dramatically, not like a bomb. It was a license validation layer I'd written in during development, originally just to protect against someone copying the repo without permission. Every time Meridian ran, it pinged a private authentication server I controlled. If the ping failed, if the server didn't recognize the license key, the system didn't crash. It didn't throw an error. It just quietly, invisibly began degrading. Wrong outputs, slightly off predictions. Nothing dramatic enough to catch immediately, but enough to be useless in any real-world deployment. I had written it for myself. I had not written it for this situation, but it applied to this situation perfectly. I said nothing about it. I went back to work on Monday. The next 2 months were the strangest of my professional life. On the surface, nothing changed. I tested software. I documented bugs. I ate lunch at my desk. Underneath the surface, Harlow was apparently mobilizing. I found out later through a former colleague who stayed in touch that the director had already begun pitching a Meridian internally as a competitive differentiator. He called it a proprietary routing intelligence layer. He'd started showing it in internal demos. He'd presented it to the board. He'd also quietly begun the process of filing a patent in my name initially because the invention was documented as mine. The plan, as best as I could reconstruct it later, was to complete the transfer once legal had given them enough cover to claim ownership. They wanted the patent filed under my name first, so there was a clear chain of invention, then transferred to Harlow through the employment clause. It was actually fairly elegant in a predatory way. Here's what they didn't know. I had registered Meridian's core architecture with the U.S. Copyright Office 4 months before that coffee machine conversation. The registration was dated. The timestamps on my personal Git repository were intact and verifiable. And the license validation server, my server, on my personal hosting account, paid for with my personal credit card, was the only thing standing between Meridian running correctly and Meridian quietly falling apart. They had a copy of the code. They did not have the key. I kept going to work. In February, Harlow announced a strategic partnership with a regional freight company, I'll call them the carrier, that moved goods across 14 states. It was a big deal for Harlow. The kind of partnership that gets mentioned in a press release, the kind that comes with a client demo. My former colleague texted me the week before. They're showing Meridian at the pitch. I read the text. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the window for a few minutes looking at my backyard. Then I did nothing because there was nothing to do. I'd already done it. The demo was on a Wednesday. I know because my former colleague told me afterward, piece by piece, over the course of several days, each message a little more stunned than the last. The director opened the presentation. He walked the carrier's team through the routing system, showed the interface, the learning curves, the optimization outputs. The carrier's people were engaged. They asked good questions. The VP of product was in the room, and so was someone from their board. This was a 7-figure conversation. Everyone in that room knew it. They ran a live test. That's when it started. The outputs were off. Not catastrophically at first, just slightly wrong in a way that wouldn't have meant anything in isolation. But the carrier's team was sharp. They had their own routing data, their own benchmarks, and they started cross-referencing. One of the carrier's people said the predicted delivery windows didn't match their historical actuals. The director said they were probably looking at a calibration difference. He pulled up more data. The data was worse. By the time they'd been running the demo for 30 minutes, Meridian was producing results that were not just inaccurate, but confidently inaccurate. The worst kind, the kind that looks authoritative while being wrong. The carrier's technical lead asked if the system had been tested on real freight data. The VP of product said yes. The technical lead pulled out her laptop. What followed, as described to me, was 45 minutes of increasingly uncomfortable silence, punctuated by polite but devastating questions. The carrier's team wasn't angry. They were worse than angry. They were unimpressed. The director suggested a calibration issue with the test environment. The carrier's CEO said they'd be in touch. They were not, in fact, in touch. Or rather, they were in touch once through their attorney to confirm they would not be proceeding with the partnership. 7 figures, gone in 45 minutes. What happened after that inside Harlow, I only know fragments of. The director blamed the engineering team. The engineering team said the system had worked perfectly in internal testing, which it had not, because I had quietly and without announcement set the license validation to a 30-day grace period. They'd had 30 days of a functioning system. Then the grace period ended and the degradation began. It timed almost perfectly for the biggest demo the director had ever tried to run. That was not intentional on my part. I want to be clear about that. The 30-day grace period was a standard setting I'd always used. The timing was luck or justice, depending on how you look at it. Legal contacted me in March, a different attorney this time, harder than the first one. She said Harlow was prepared to proceed with the IP transfer. I said I'd have my attorney respond. Margaret responded. Margaret's response was thorough. It included the copyright registration date, the get timestamps, the receipts, a citation of Connecticut General Statute 31-57G, which protects employee inventions developed without company resources, and a detailed explanation of what exactly would happen if Harlow attempted to enforce the employment clause in court. Harlow's attorney went quiet for 11 days. On day 12, I received a different kind of communication. Not a legal threat, a settlement proposal. They would drop the IP claim. They would pay my legal fees. They came to just under $4,000. And provide a standard letter confirming I had developed Meridian independently. I accepted. I gave my 2 weeks notice the same day. My last day at Harlow, I packed one box. There wasn't much. A coffee mug, a small plant I'd kept alive for 3 years against considerable odds, a photo of my daughters on a hiking trail in Vermont. I said goodbye to the people I actually liked, which were not many, but were genuine. I did not say goodbye to the director. I did not say goodbye to the VP of product. I walked out at 4:47 on a Friday afternoon and sat in my car in the parking garage for a while, not crying, not celebrating, just breathing. The carrier, as it turned out, found a routing vendor 6 weeks later. I know because the news was in an industry newsletter, and I have a Google alert set for the carrier's name. Old habit from my research days. The vendor they chose was a smaller firm with a solid reputation. Good for them. Meridian is still mine. I spent the following summer rebuilding it, cleaner architecture, better documentation, the license layer replaced with something more sophisticated. I brought on a development partner, someone I'd met through a technical forum who is brilliant in the ways I'm not. We incorporated in Delaware in September. We have 3 pilot clients as of this month, 2 regional carriers, and a last mile delivery company that reached out through a mutual contact. None of them know the full story of where Meridian started. Not yet. Maybe someday I'll tell them over dinner, and it will be funny in the way things are funny when they're far enough behind you. Here's what I know now that I didn't know 3 years ago. Companies like Harlow count on you not knowing your rights. They count on you being scared of the word litigation. They count on the employment agreement sounding more absolute than it is, because most people don't read Connecticut General Statute 31-57G. Most people have never heard of it. I hadn't either until Margaret. If you build something on your own time with your own equipment and it has nothing to do with company resources, know your state's law. Register your work. Keep your timestamps. Keep your receipts. Do it before you mention it to anyone, especially before you mention it by the coffee machine on a Thursday afternoon. The director is still at Harlow. I see his name occasionally in LinkedIn updates I don't click on. The partnership with the carrier never happened. I don't know if those things are connected. I assume they are. He never understood what went wrong at the demo. As far as I know, he still doesn't. That's fine. You can take the code. You cannot take the mind that built it, and you definitely cannot take the key. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently, and I keep landing on the same answer. Not much. Maybe I wouldn't have mentioned Meridian by the coffee machine. That was naive. But everything that came after, I don't regret it. What happened to the director wasn't something I planned. That matters to me. I didn't set a trap. I built something with a protection layer, the way any careful developer would. And when someone tried to run it without the key, it failed the way it was always designed to fail. The cause was their decision. The effect was their loss. I didn't engineer the outcome. I just built something that told the truth about what it was. That's the thing about trying to take what isn't yours. It almost never works the way you imagine because you're working with incomplete information. The director saw code. He saw a system that performed beautifully in internal testing. He saw a competitive advantage he could attach his name to. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see because he never asked, was the architecture underneath. He didn't understand what made Meridian run. He just knew that it did. And that's the gap that gets people like him in the end. Not justice in any grand sense. Just the ordinary mechanical consequences of not knowing what you actually have. I think about Margaret a lot too. She was matter of fact in a way that steadied me when I needed it. She didn't promise outcomes. She said probably when she meant probably and definitely when she meant definitely. And she explained Connecticut General Statute 31-57G to me in plain language and handed me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost, which was the sense that I had rights and that they were specific and real and worth knowing. That's what good counsel does. It doesn't rescue you. It gives you information and then trusts you to use it. What I learned, and I mean really learned, not just understood intellectually, is that expertise is not transferable by theft. You can copy a file. You can copy a repository. You can even copy an interface and make it look like yours. What you cannot copy is the decade of thinking that produced it, the judgment calls embedded in every architectural decision, the knowing of why something was built a certain way and not another. The director had Meridian's code. He did not have my understanding of it. And when something went wrong, when the grace period expired and the predictions started drifting, he had no idea where to look because he'd never built it. He'd only taken it. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a while. Sitting in my car in the Harlow parking garage on my last day, I felt a lot of things, and some of them were not generous, but what I mostly felt was tired and clear, the way you feel after something difficult is finally finished. The plant I carried out in that one box is still alive, by the way. It sits on the windowsill in my home office, next to the second-hand laptop I still use when I'm working late. I've never replaced it. It still runs fine. Meridian is real now. It has clients. It has a co-founder. It has a Delaware LLC and a proper license structure and documentation I'm genuinely proud of. None of that happened because the director tried to steal it. But none of it happened in spite of it either. It happened because I knew what I'd built, protected it from the beginning, and when someone tried to take it, I let them find out for themselves what that meant. You can't shortcut your way to something someone else spent years building, and you definitely can't run it without the key.